Welcome to the questions and answers part for session 4 of a lecture on international political economy. The first question goes like this. How profitable, of course if it is it for a state to invest in the World Bank or IMF, for instance, for a powerful country like Germany, Japan, and also for not so rich countries like Latvia, Spain, etc. First, it must be noted that the World Bank and the IMF are different in quite a few ways, one of them being the way in which they are funded. The World Bank is actually a bank in the sense that they give out credits to certain development projects and they get their money from issuing bonds. And these bonds can be bought and sold on financial markets. So if you are an investor, you could, for example, go to your bank and say, I want to buy some World Bank bonds. At least in theory you could. And these bonds are not very risky and not very profitable investments because the states that participate in the World Bank guarantee for the repayment of these bonds. So they have a AAA rating, but they don't have a very high interest rates. So this is a rather conservative investment. This is the way the World Bank gets most of their funding. However, of course, the states guarantee for their bonds and also they also make some contributions. The IMF, on the other hand, is really something like a big pool of money where all states that are part of the IMF contribute a certain proportion to this big pool of money. And then the IMF is an institution that administers this big pool of money and hands out credit lines where it is needed. So the institutions are quite different. And for the most part, probably countries that pay their contributions wouldn't think of these contributions directly as investment that has to be profitable. But however, you could still ask the question, I just rephrase the question, what are the motivations of states to make these contributions to the World Bank and or the IMF? You could think of a number of motivations for this. So first you could think, and to some extent this is hopefully also true, a little bit idealistically, maybe they actually want to help others and they do not want developing nations to remain in poverty and they don't want anyone to suffer from financial disarray. So this is why they contribute to both institutions. However, this would probably not be enough of a motivation. Secondly, sometimes you hear that there are political motivations, particularly when it comes to the founding of these institutions, which happened, as you might remember, at the end of World War II. So you could probably think it's plausible that those who founded these institutions really had an interest in not having another world war, and they hope that stable economic development and a stable international monetary system would help avoiding another big war. And this is still a little bit idealistic. Thirdly, you must of course say that countries themselves oftentimes suffer when there's chaos or when there are problems in other countries. So the international monetary system is really an international system, and if an important country in this system suffers from monetary instability, this affects all others, and particularly if it's a big country. So if it's just a very small country somewhere in the world, this might, for example, not really affect the German economy to a large degree. However, if it's already a country like Greece, then it might probably be some kind of problem for Germany. If a country like Italy gets into problems, then this could cause big problems for Germany. And also something similar is true for development. If there is stable economic development in other parts of the world, these are of course also markets for German products, for example. So there's this kind of interest, and the smaller countries also have their interest in this working. And then you must say, on the other hand, of course, being a member of the IMF is the prerequisite for getting loans from the IMF. So countries that are afraid that they might have financial difficulties in the future, they have an even stronger incentive to take part in the IMF. And next and final point is that, of course, for all these countries, it's also a way to wield power. For example, the United States, they are the biggest contributors to these institutions, and for this reasons, they also have the biggest say in these institutions, which also means that they have the biggest say in the decisions on who's gonna receive credits from the IMF, for example. And this, of course, also gives them political leverage in terms of economic policies. So, for example, in the Asian crisis, roughly 20 years ago, the IMF pushed for market-friendly reforms, and this was in the material interest and as well as in the ideological line of the United States. So they had their interest in this happening, and also more narrowly politically. For example, at the moment, Iran is applying for IMF loans, and here it's also very likely that the United States is hindering this process because they don't want to help Iran politically. So it is not really an investment that you do for profit as a country, but it is money that you spend, and there are good reasons why you might spend it. Next question. Why in the UN there is the design for the permanent members each having a veto over proposals before the Security Council? It seems unfair to let only one permanent member to have the right to deny a proposal which might affect many other countries. It's true, this does seem unfair. However, international relations is only to a certain degree about fairness, and you have to think about this the other way around maybe. So what the UN Security Council decides becomes international law. So if the UN Security Council decides this and this has to happen in a certain armed conflict or in any other issue, then states have to comply or face certain sanctions. So this is something that is important. And now you can ask, why would a state be willing to take part in an institution that will then sanction this state? And there the incentives are quite different for very, very powerful, very, very big states, and for not so very powerful and not so big states. And so the question is, how can you motivate big important countries like at the time the United States or the Soviet Union and maybe also China to really become part of this kind of system where they have to bow down to rules that others may make? And one of the ways to get these states to even take part in this whole charade is by saying, well, if you don't like the rules, then you can just veto them. So these rules, which are unfair in the sense that they are unequal, they mirror the power that these states would have without this international institution. And this is also the only reason why such states even take part in these institutions, because they half voluntarily give up power. And if you have very, very much power, you're probably not going to be willing to give it up all. And why would the United States be part of an institution where 100 of very small, very poor nations can make a law that the US has then to fulfill? And so it is unfair, but to a certain degree, this is how international relations work. In the last years, the US has opposed the WTO, or at least called for reform. Isn't that strange, given that they promoted it? yes, you could say it is kind of strange. However, this presupposes that a nation or a country is a coherent actor from whom you expect coherent behavior. And this does not necessarily has to be the case because there can be changes of the way they see the world, or there can simply be changes of government, and this is true for dictatorships as well as for democracies. So if one government decides something and then 20 years later there's a completely different government, which can happen in almost all states, then it's quite plausible that they will have another stance on certain questions. And even if this weren't gonna happen, it might very well be that after 20 years of pursuing a certain policy, you evaluate this policy and say, well, we thought this was a good idea at the time, but now we know it's actually not a good idea. So it might seem strange or paradoxical, but it isn't necessarily. The next two questions concern the G7 or G8 and the Russian Federation. So first question is about the G7. I said in the lecture that this is not an organization. La-di-da. As you said in the lecture, there is not a formal procedure to exclude a country, and that the members can agree or not to come together. Does that mean that if, for example, the United States would not want to include Russia, this would be enough to exclude them, or is there an unanimous decision to be taken by all members? Again, the G7 or G8, they do not really exist formally. This is more of an informal club. So you don't have to think about this like a formal club with club rules, but rather like, I don't know, an informal gathering, like you with your friends meeting every other week to, I don't know, play poker or watch a certain TV show, which you should not do at the moment, but let's say you did. And then one of your friends just, I don't know, misbehaved in some kind of way, and then you don't want them around anymore. And so the question is who decides that? And then of course it might be that just like two of the friends that are always gathering don't get along with one another anymore. And then the question is, okay, which one of the two is not allowed to come anymore? And then of course it's a question of power politics, and then it's a question of whose voice counts more. And in your hypothetical scenario, it might be that if only the United States had a problem with Russia, then it might be that the United States could not have pushed all the others to exclude Russia. However, the voice of the United States will always count more than, let's say, the voice of Canada. And if Canada wouldn't have an issue with Russia, but the United States would have an issue with Russia, then the United States would probably have their ways of persuading Canada that they should have an issue with Russia. Okay, next question also goes on with this, so I'll go on to the next question. You said that the Russian Federation was excluded from the G8 in 2014, but there was many talks, especially last summer, about Russia's return into the G8 forum. How realistic do you see Russia's comeback to the G group? The return could be linked to the fact that you said the world's formula now seems to be multipolar, and the opinion of Russia would be ponderable for the world's leaders because Russian Federation has a kind of economic and territorial authority in Eastern Europe and Asia. In case their return would be realistic, what would be the fate of economic sanctions program against Russia? And I think this is an important question. They're also linking the G8 membership to the economic sanction is important here because they belong together to as the measures that Western states took to punish Russia for the Crimean invasion. What I would generally say that with this whole issue, Russia as well as those powers that sanctioned Russia, they all maneuvered themselves into an impossible situation because on the one hand Russia did something that was very, very hard for all the others to swallow, And so the others reacted in a way where they said, no, we're not going to take this, we're going to sanction you, and we're going to exclude you from the G8 until you give up Crimea. However, if it would not have been clear then, by now it should be clear that Russia is not going to give up Crimea. And so the others have to decide, will they take on sanctioning Russia indefinitely because of one peninsula, or will they at some point return to the status quo ante when it comes to the mutual relations, and thereby losing some of their face, because they said, we're not going to give you anything until you give up Crimea, and you have to give up Crimea, and the Russians won't do it. So it's like the Russians cannot give back Crimea without giving their face, and the other states cannot stop the sanction on Russia without giving theirs. And this might still take a couple of months or years, but as far as I would guess it, I'd say that the sanctions and also the exclusion from the G8 maybe will wear off at some point. While, however, I think that the question of the sanctions, economic sanctions, are more important than G7, G8 membership, because there still is the G20 as a bigger discussion forum that's still there. Next question. I didn't quite understand what embedded liberalism is. Could you explain it further, please? The concept of embeddedness goes back to Karl Polanyi, and the general idea is that we have these market relations which shape capitalism. So these are social relations that are mostly based on actors pursuing their egoistic interest and relating to others as others who also pursue their egoistic interest, and then the interactions are mainly based on payment and barter and trade and so on. And these social relations are very important in modern capitalist market societies. However, Polanyi argues that you cannot build a society on these kinds of relations only, because in short, humans could not live this way, societies could not exist this way, and humans just wouldn't take it. And also, some of the losers of these market relations would hardly be able to survive. So you have to embed these market relations into other social forms. And traditionally, there were certain traditional social forms, like certain family relations, certain other social relations within villages, or some other forms of traditional bonds between human beings. So the effects of these market relations could be somewhat softened and ameliorated by these other social relations that the market was embedded into. However, the market expanded over the course of decades and centuries, and so many of these other traditional social forms in which the market used to be embedded, they waned away. And then there is the possibility of another way to embed the market, which is more directly, more explicit, and more political. And this is also where the welfare state would take place, because the welfare state is supposed to do exactly this. It's supposed to make sure that whatever goes wrong for any individual within the market relations, that there will be some kind of social security net in which human beings can be caught. So we think of embedded liberalism in the sense that we have liberal market relations where individuals and businesses and so on pursue their best own interest in relation to others, and that this can be a good thing, and Polanyi admits it's a good thing. Marx admits it's a good thing in the sense that it makes possible very high rates of production and productivity. So it's not about this being a bad thing, but about this also having problematic consequences for many who are affected. and then you embed these kinds of relations in other social structures and relations where these harmful consequences are then softened. And in a narrower sense, for the embedded liberalism of the mid-20th century, John Ruggie, who came up with the term, he mainly argued that there are those two goals that are both worth striving for, but they are mutually exclusive to some extent, is on the one hand to have a strong welfare state that will make sure that there is such a thing as mass welfare in capitalism, so that not only the rich get ever richer, but that everyone gets their share. On the other hand, you want some sort of international free trade regime where a lot of international trade is possible, because this also rises the overall welfare. And there is a tension here, because if you allow for free trade, which means you don't take many tariffs from companies and you let businesses do all kind of transnational business relations as they see fit, this means that the states have to give up certain ways of intervening in the economy, and also of taking too much taxes from these businesses. So you have to bridge these this cleavage between these two goals somehow, and here this is what supposedly embedded liberalism did then. And this then of course sounds very good, that you have all the good things about capitalism without having all the bad things. So you have the high production, high productivity, without having, I don't know, mass poverty or anything like this. And the next question goes to the limit of this concept, asking, are there certain structural limits in capitalism within which such social redistribution can take place, and what would they be? Very briefly, I already argued last week that if you think of capitalism, you have to think that there are certain requirements that you need to meet and to have in order to have capitalism. So you need capital in the sense that you need individuals or businesses or organizations who have large amounts of money that they could invest and thereby turn this money into capital and make it productive and make production happen. Secondly, you need a labor force, so you need human beings that are, for whatever reasons, willing to sell their labor power on the labor market and become wage laborers. And thirdly, you need an overall situation in which investment is profitable. And this, among other things, means that there have to be enough people and there have to be enough markets so that the products that are produced are also bought. But in general, it also means that if you have $1 million and you invest it somewhere, be it by buying stocks or by building a factory or by opening whatever kind of business, then you must be able to reasonably presume that after, I don't know, 2 years, this $1 million will be $1.2 million. So there has to be reasonable reason to believe that there will be profit. And of course, if you redistribute too much in this sense, then there's on the one hand the danger that nobody will have capital anymore. So if you redistribute all wealth, then there won't be any wealthy individuals who can even invest $1 million because no one will have them. And even if you take care of this somehow by, I don't know, let's say allowing certain kinds of organization to have these amounts of money, then you still cannot tax profit so high that it won't be profitable. So you have to have a situation in which investing money is still profitable. And there are some very radical leftist Keynesians who would say, well, if these investors, these capital owners are not willing to invest their capital, then we can just force them by law to invest. But it's somehow shaky how this will work. Next question, once again about Polanyi and embedded liberalism. Are we currently witnessing the second time in which the economy becomes independent and ever dominant in relation to the society, so that in the end society is embedded in the economy? In case you agree, do we need a New Deal in order to prevent possible civil war or the rise of extreme right governments? I don't want to go in this too deep, but I can definitely say there are many social scientists who make exactly this case and make this case with Polanyi. So Polanyi's idea about the rise of fascism is that the problem were that markets became ever more disembedded, socially disembedded. So there was this great transformation, as the book was called, and then there had to be some sort of counter movement which was provoked by it. And what was us, and this is in the best sense, this might have been the New Deal as something which is about re-embedding the market. On the other hand, there's also fascism as a result of this this process of disembedding under which human beings suffered, and from the suffering they somehow turned into angry fascists, and then the whole drama of the first half of the 20th century unfolded. And this is his idea, and there are quite a few who also argue that this is what's happening now. I'm not totally convinced by it, but that's it for you. Do you think that we will see a renationalization or at least a regionalization of industrial production in the upcoming years? Or do you think such a trend would be limited to some very important products, e.g. medicine or protective gear? I don't want to overplay my card as a prophet right here. What I can definitely say is there is some talk of engaging in these kinds of policies, particularly when it comes to medical production. And it was even there before we had the COVID-19 pandemic. So in 2019, for example, in Germany, there were debates over the fact that certain crucial medical supplies are no longer produced in Germany. So whenever Germans need penicillin or some other antibiotics, maybe, they have to be imported from China. And this is not a problem as long as the supply chains work. However, if there's ever some kind of problem, we won't have crucial medical supplies here anymore. And so there is the idea that a certain part of the production should stay within Germany, or at least within the region of Europe. And I'm quite sure that some of this will happen. Of course, this also always means that you're gonna pay more for it than you would if you had it produced in China, because it's not produced in China because somebody just wanted it like this, but because it's economically more efficient to produce it in China and then ship it around half of the world to have it here. So if you produce it here, it will probably cost some more, and then possibly there will, right now, many people will tend to saying, well, let's produce masks and some crucial products over here, and maybe in 5 or 10 years the pendulum will swing back to the argument of economic efficiency. And there's also some general talk about regionalizing the economy. For example, Donald Trump's idea is also to keep a lot of steel production in the United States, and weirdly also coal production in the United States. However, I'm not so convinced that there will be a kind of reindustrialization in these kinds of industries. So I think it's more plausible to think this about very specific, strategically important goods rather than about the whole bandwidth of industry. And one last thing, that you have to distinguish two different arguments that are made here. On the one hand, there is this rather strategic argument where it's being said about medical supplies or also about communications technology. So you probably remember the discussions about the the 5G mobile phone networks, that it's a problem if we have to rely on all these things, in all these things on China, because maybe they will use this as a card to play us, or maybe they will use this to spy on us. This is what the Europeans said, this is what the Americans said, United States Americans. So this is this kind of strategic argument, and there's also the argument of industrial policy, which Donald Trump also plays, where he says, well, we want to keep these jobs in the United States, so we want to have steelworking jobs and coal mining jobs in the United States. And so these are two different kind of arguments for this re-regionalization, and I think it's more plausible that some part of the strategic argument will have consequences, while I'm not so sure whether the industrial policy arguments will really have much consequence. Is there a possibility of decapitalization due to the deceleration in globalization or triadization? I think by decapitalization you mean a shift to another mode of production than capitalism. It's just the way I understand the word. You could also say that decapitalization means something else, but from the context, I guess this is what you mean. And here I would say everything is possible. However, in order for there being a shift to another way of organizing the economy, there has to be more than just a crisis of the old way. Namely, there have to be strong social movements and social forces that actually want something new and have an idea of something new that they want. And this is something I don't see at the moment to a large degree. So you have some very impressive social movements in the last years, particularly of course maybe Fridays for Futures most recently, which seems to have a rather big impact. However, so far you could not call this an anti-capitalist movement in the sense that they have a common idea of moving beyond capitalism. This just seemed to be something that not many people want right now, and Fridays for Future seem to be torn about this. So there are some among them who would argue this way, some who wouldn't argue this way. And in short, as long as there are no big social movements that demand something else than capitalism, there will probably be capitalism, and that's probably what we're gonna have then. Next, I think it's interesting to think about advantages and disadvantages of the differences between capitalisms you mentioned on page 14, especially in times of the COVID-19, for example, by looking at the United States. Maybe you can mention some details about it. So when we think about the different welfare states and the COVID-19 pandemic, we probably have to look at two levels here. So first we have to look, of course, at the healthcare system. And so the questions, who will get tested, who will get treated, under which condition, and how will this work out. And here it seems that at least in the beginning of the crisis, that the American system with very low rates of health insurance as compared to other nations of which are comparably rich, seems to have caused problems with tests being available, but also with such things as paid sick leave. So if you're sick, you still have to go to work in many cases in the United States, and if you don't go to work because you're sick, then you might not get your wage, and this is very different in most other industrial nations. So this really seems to be a problem there. However, what you must say about almost all Western countries, not only Western countries, is that there was a lot of effort in the last decades to save money in the healthcare sector and to shrink hospitals and so on and so on. And this is something that certainly proves to be a problem right now. So you have some countries like South Korea and Germany and Austria that still have very many hospital beds per capita and also intensive care beds per capita. And then you have countries like Sweden or Italy that have far fewer beds per capita. And you could argue that there's a relation between the death rates and between the beds per capita. So there might be problems in this sense also. And this of course relates to the shift from embedded liberalism to neoliberalism. And then the second area you could want to look at is not so much the effects of the disease itself directly, but rather the effects of the economic crisis that comes with the disease, be it because of the disease or be it because of social distancing. And here you also have these strong differences between most European countries, where you have in most of them systems in which businesses can apply for programs with the state, where the state says, okay, business owners, we see you cannot pay your employees right now because you have troubles because of the pandemic or because of the social distancing measures, so we pay the wages for you and you don't have to fire your employees. And this has advantages for many of the involved parties, because after the crisis is over, there will still be more of these employees with their businesses, which means that it's probably easier to restart the economy once again. And when it comes to cost, of course, this costs money, these programs. However, having all these people unemployed would also cost money. In the United States, where you don't have these kinds of programs to a large degree, there is much more unemployment, and many of these unemployed people once again also then might lose their health insurance. So this is quite problematic. Maybe so far. Next, three concerns dictatorship and capitalism maybe. So, thus the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening of the Chinese communist model to Western economies prove that the communist political economy is not long-term maintainable. You could definitely make this case, and there are many who do make this case. However, I'm always a little bit wary about making economic efficiency the point in this, because when I think why I don't want to live in Maoism or Stalinism, it's not mostly their economic inefficiency, it's mostly the danger of being killed for no reason. And so this would always be my go-to argument for saying why I'm against Maoist or Stalinist rule, and not that they are economically inefficient. If we, however, go to the question of economic efficiency, then I think one must distinguish between the Chinese model and the Soviet model, because in the Chinese model we really had these at least two very, very catastrophic political economic attempts, and one of them not so much economic, but we had the Great Leap forward, and we had the Cultural Revolution, and in both of these processes millions died, and this was in part economic insanity right there. When it comes to the Soviet Union, it's not so easy to make this case about economic inefficiency, because if you look at where Russia and the other parts of the Soviet Union stood in 1917 and where they stood in 1977 and then compare this to most other countries in the world, it's hard to make the case that they developed less efficient. So they were even able to keep up with the United States for much of the space race, for much of the weapons race. So there was certain economic efficiencies there, and they certainly did not achieve the same level of mass welfare as the United States and any other Western states did. However, once again, I would not say that this was the main problem of the Soviet Union. I would rather see the problem in politics and in individual rights there. And then it was mostly the last 10, 15 years of the Soviet Union where it probably did not work economically anymore. But over the whole course of the existence of the Soviet Union, I would not say that economic efficiency was the main problem there. However, you're right in that there are very few people, and I wouldn't make the case either, though very few people would make the case, let's have a centrally planned economy right now. Yeah. Next question. China lives out the form of government of the dictatorship. Of course, you initially associated with something negative. However, look at the economy shows that China is one of the economically strongest countries in the world. To what extent do dictatorships play a negative or positive role? And here, once again, one has to be careful to make the question of being a dictatorship being something positive or something negative about it being able to make the economy develop faster or not so fast. And in general, I would say you're right. China is definitely a dictatorship, and China does definitely develop economically quite strongly. What I however, find the more interesting question is if we look at states that were far behind in their economic development and then were able to catch up, what kind of states or what kind of economic policies did they pursue? And typically none of them really pursued a free trade policies, and those countries that pursued a free trade policy, they all failed. So those countries that were able to have this catching up process in which they caught up with countries that were economically speaking decades or maybe even a century ahead of them, they all had certain protectionist policies in place, and then strategically opened up certain sectors of the economy and then focused on exports. So this is what Germany did in the 19th century, the United States did in the 19th century, Japan did, later the so-called tiger states did, and this is also what China did. So this seems to be the better way to catch up economically. However, if you think about what this model is about, it's also pretty clear that not all states can do this at the same time, because this means having trade surplus, and not all countries can have trade surpluses at the same time. So this is to some extent also a beggar thy neighbor policy, in the sense that you have economic success at the condition of others not having success. Next question, why is it sometimes questioned that China is indeed a capitalist country, or rather, which aspects make it difficult to clearly categorize it as such? Of course, this depends on the definition of capitalism, and if you say that capitalism is there as soon as the profit logic dominates production, I would say we have this in China to a big degree. So production is dominated by investors investing capital to make profit and then also live from the profit, and this is very important in China. However, you could also some would also argue that we only want to talk of capitalism if the state is not too strong, and if the state does not meddle with business decisions. And in China, there are very strong relations between the state, the party, and the business elites. So it is not really free business. However, you see these kinds of relations to lesser degree also in many Western countries where there's no real total independence between business elites and political elites. However, it does not work the way it does work in China. And another counter argument that might be made concerning China, that officially it's still run by a communist party. So you might say, well, if it's run by a communist party, it cannot be capitalist. But I would say, oh, yes, it can. Next question. The term third world could lead to a paternalistic view, as you said, and that we should rather use global south. Is it mainly due to the rating by numbers? The global south includes the same nations and regions as third world. I assume, so couldn't there be also some potential for paternalistic discussions and views if you use this term with the same thinking lying beneath? This is absolutely the case, and we should not think about words as being magic words where you just like use this one expression and then it will magically make people free or unfree or make discourses paternalistic or empowering. This is not the way we should think about words. So even the best intentioned word can be used in the worst kind of way. So if you have, if you try to avoid racist language and then you use very nice words to talk about minorities, about many people talk in racist terms, then you can still use these very nice words in the form of a racist discourse, and this happens all over the place. So using nice words doesn't mean stopping being racist. However, certain terms are at certain times always associated with certain ideas of thinking about the world. And over the last couple of decades, the term third world has been associated with this idea of these poor regions whom we have to help. And this is a problematic discourse. And the term global south is more associated with the idea of political struggles, and it does not have the strong paternalistic association. So I would say we should rather go with this term. However, it might very well be that in 10 years global south is used exactly the same way as the third world was 10 years ago, and we haven't won much, but for the time being we might win a little bit. Next question. I thought that the concept of good governance is sometimes criticized, e.g. when it comes to developing countries. Could you point out why, if the critics differ from the critics on global governance in terms of loss of democracy? So there are people who criticize both terms, and some criticize one term and some criticize the other term. So of course there is a connection between the two concepts, and it emerged around the same time. The idea is we look at the way that governing is done. That's common to both terms. The concept good governance, however, is used for different purposes. It's used for purposes particularly of foreign aid being given, or maybe even credits by the World Bank being given, and then you only give these to governments or countries which meet certain standards of good governance. So you look in these countries and say, well, no, in your country there's too much corruption, or there's too little free press, so you don't have good governance, so you don't get our money. And there are good reasons to pursue this kind of argument. However, this of course is also problematic in the sense that there are of course some institutions in the global north that define what good governance is, and then they evaluate nations in the global south, and so some find this problematic. So there is something about the power relation between global north and global south, and about the global north being the ones who define what the countries of the south should do and what would be good there. So this is the argument here. However, this of course does not justify justify any kind of behavior by governments in the South. When it comes to the critique of global governance, it's rather a question of democratic sovereignty. So here the critics would rather argue that democracy has to be bound to a fixed idea of sovereignty. So we need to know where the government is in order that we can elect it or diselect it. And this is what we use if there's global governance where NGOs that are not really accountable to anyone and corporations who are not really accountable to anyone do governance together with governments, that we use this kind of democratic accountability. So the concepts are used in different ways, and the critiques also aim at different problems. Next, as we referred to the German meat industry, how is it possible that the working conditions are still so bad in some economic sectors in a highly developed country like Germany? So first, I would like to strike out one word, which is the word still. Because I'm not saying that there was ever a golden age without bad working conditions. However, this kind of development in the meat industry in Germany is rather recent. And you can give some reasons for it. Maybe two most important ones are, on one hand the labor market reforms in Germany roughly 20 years ago, in which what's called a Leiharbeit was introduced. So it's like borrowing work. So this opened up the labor market for certain configurations in which one company employs workers and then lends these workers to another company where they actually work. And then we also have other configurations of subcontractors, and so the whole labor market becomes rather confusing there, so it's not easy to oversee it. And then around the same time we also have the opening of labor markets to European migration, and this made it possible for German slaughterhouses to become places where people from all over Eastern and Middle to Eastern Europe basically mainly work under conditions that do oftentimes not comply with German laws. But there are maybe some workarounds there where they are not formally employed by the German slaughterhouse, but are employed by their Romanian employer, who then sells their labor power to the German slaughterhouse. So there are these kinds of configurations there. And then there's also the problem that these workers are typically not very organized or unionized, and it's not entirely clear which union is responsible for them. And even for them, it might not always be clear whether it's in their best interest to organize in unions, because they want these jobs and they have these jobs because they can perform it for less money than any German would be willing to do so. So we have these kinds of confusion in the labor market and these irregulated sectors, and this makes it possible then of course to exploit these workers in ways in which you could not easily exploit German workers in Germany, because they would just not be willing to work on these conditions, and if they had to, they would probably complain somewhere. The last two questions concern international trade, and they particularly aim at the questions why there is so little trade between southern countries. So here on this slide that I showed you, on the one hand, see that trade is mainly between the triads, so between Eastern Asia, Northern America, and Western Europe, but also that if you look at these countries, their main trade remains intra-region, while the main trade of the smaller regions when it comes to trade, so Southern America, Central America and Africa, the Gulf states, and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, is more extra regional. And so some of you asked why this is the case. I think the main point to the answer is that these numbers that are represented here are not about the total tonnage of trade, but about the total value of trade. And so you can, it's probably quite easy to see that the highest flow of money and of payment will be between richer countries and poorer countries, and not between poorer countries and other poorer countries. And you also see that in the map, in that there are not any arrows at all between Southern and Central America and Africa. So the trade that happens between these two regions, despite these regions being rather close to one another geographically, is not so big that it would even appear on this map. So probably, if I'm quite sure that you only think of the tonnage, so of the weight of the trade, then probably the trade between Southern American countries is also more than the trade between Southern American countries and other regions. However, if you look at the value of the goods that are traded, then for the exports as well as for the imports, it's more attractive for these countries and more relevant for these countries to trade with richer countries, because they are the ones who can buy the more expensive goods, and this is also where they have to buy their more expensive imports. Okay, that's it for today. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Goodbye.